Hi, everyone. Welcome. Our speaker today is Gerrish, who is an associate professor of public administration. His research focuses on government performance systems, in particular, how to optimize performance while avoiding unintended behaviors. His teaching interests include research methods, public budgeting, and finance. His presentation today is titled "What Meta-analysis Can Tell Us About the Social Sciences." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerrish.
Trying to get intimidated by the full room here today. So thanks everyone for coming at a really busy time this semester. I was trying to think of a topic that would be generally useful to folks across the campus, since it's intended to be something that grows across campus, rather than something about my own particular research, because although I will talk about some of my research in here, I think this generally applies broadly across the social sciences. And I've become something of, I'm an evangelist for sort of two things in my classrooms. Number one, Microsoft Excel, and number two, meta-analysis. And so in getting more people involved, I've had a lot of great collaboration success with colleagues, because everyone, once they see meta-analyses, they see them published and they read them, they start to understand the benefit of them, but are oftentimes intimidated by getting into the process of actually doing it themselves, because there's a whole other statistical method to it. And I'll apologize in advance, because Tony Cruz, who spoke last week, is an anthropologist and gets really great pictures about their sites and the layers of dirt and everything. And I don't have quite as many of those things. So I'll try to bring in pictures and animations whenever I can in order to spruce up this presentation. That happened. There we go. So let me go back to mouse. What happens? There we go. So we'll talk about it's an overview, for those who see this later, it's sort of an overview of what meta-analysis is, common misperceptions of meta-analysis or criticism that you'll hear of it, the advantages I see of using meta-analyses compared to a literature review or any other review of the literature, a very quick and dirty version of how you would implement a meta-analysis, and then two examples from my literature, from my research, which is performance management on organizational performance, and the impact of income and race on the distribution of urban trees, which you can see just from the beginning. Those are two it's a wide area to cover. They both had particular challenges that made this a useful discussion. And then finally, we'll wrap up with what meta-analysis could tell us about social sciences and some resources and references for those who are more interested in learning for themselves. So meta-analysis is a term that was coined all the way back in 1978 by a researcher in this area named Gene Glass. And because meta means, of itself, essentially. And so this is an analysis of analyses. And what's great about a meta-analysis is that it's even more specific than the other two types of things you might have heard about, which is a literature review or systematic review, which is that not only does it review the literature, so what does the literature say about a particular topic, but then it reviews that literature in a more systematic process, because a literature review oftentimes covers the most widely cited literature, which has been which is published first, and sort of set the field in motion. A systematic review says what's all the literature that's out there, and try to find that through processes. And meta-analysis adds to that a systematic way to actually code those papers in the systematic review process, and start to say something about the summary level effects of what the literature has found. So one of the things right off the bat you'll see is it really only works primarily for quantitative studies, at least the meta-analysis version that I'm going to talk about only works for quantitative studies. And so, but the systematic review process works for all sorts of different studies. Qualitative work quite well for that as well. One of the statistics I found just this week, just on Twitter, was that half of all scientific papers were published in the last 12 years, according to a Science of Science, which is a book out just this year. So if you're trying to keep up with what's going on in a literature, it is becoming increasingly hard to do so as the proliferation of journals and quantitative methods, as doing analyses has become easier through free software like R or lower cost software like Stata, and just a proliferation of doctoral programs in general. There's more and more scientific papers out there. So keeping up with them becomes more and more difficult. So saying what we know about a particular subject becomes increasingly impossible to do for someone who isn't spending all of their time doing it. So meta-analysis provides an option to not do that. And meta-analysis itself is incredibly recent. So this is an n-gram, which is basically a search of books and Google Books going back from 1975 to today. So from 1975, there was the term meta-analysis functionally did not exist, right? And since then, right, you can see this exponential increase in the term. So even if even if you've been around the block for a while, you know, you're a senior faculty at a particular department, when you started your doctoral program or even started as an assistant professor, you would not have heard of the term meta-analysis probably in use at all. It just wasn't there. There were folks percolating and creating the systems and the statistics have been around even since the 50s, but ramped up in the 70s. But the processes for doing it, what hasn't been around for many. So it's really a new method and one that's becoming increasingly popular. So let's describe the basics of what meta-analysis looks like and then some advantages of it. So the basic of the meta-analysis is that there is a relationship between two variables, which is the subject of study, and particularly numerous studies. I say the cutoff is usually about 30 studies, but you know, there's debate about how many studies you really need, but at least sort of 15 studies have studied this particular relationship. So you have some X variable, which we call independent variables, and you have some sort of key independent variable of interest, which could be some public program, it could be some new policy or some law, right? So one could be like, what's the effect of the Affordable Care Act, which would be some key independent variable. And then you have some Y or some dependent variable, which is the outcome of interest that's being studied. And so we have this key relationship between the two, between these two different variables. And so what you're really studying here, the key focus here is this relationship. It's not the independent variable of interest. It's not the dependent variable. It is the quantitative statistical relationship between those two variables. And there are lots of things that sort of mediate or moderate the effect of that relationship, which could be some things we call like time, place, and sample, which are sort of issues related to generalizability of that relationship. So this sample occurred in this year among this population, while that sample here occurred just last year among a very different population. Those are issues related to generalizability. You've got issues related to research design, control variables in a statistical model, or identification strategy, which economists might call sort of endogeneity issues. You know, did you use instrumental variable or fixed effects or something like that? And those are sort of the issues related to internal validity. And then you've got other things like interaction terms, data selection, and you know, other settings, which I would call sort of theoretical concerns. So you've got concerns about how the program was designed, which is like, well, in theory, programs that do this are going to be better than programs that do that. So you've got sort of this theoretical approach as well. And so meta-analysis allows you to sort of combine both the study of the relationship overall with the study of these particular effects that we think matter for how this program, policy, or law would have been. So there's a lot of common misperceptions of meta-analysis. One is that meta-analysis can show any particular result, which is actually pretty true. I mean, you can essentially design a meta-analysis that you can show a positive or negative relationship. And in fact, that's sort of a strength, right? Because if you think of policies or programs that get implemented poorly are going to have a negative impact or no impact, and programs or policies that are implemented properly or with particular considerations in mind would show a stronger positive effect. In some ways, you're showing that meta-analysis can show any result, but you're just showing that the implementation matters, right? And so meta-analysis there is a strength that as long as you're being very transparent about what you're measuring here, you can show kind of any result, which is important because we think that things should be moderated by the way you implement them. There's a criticism called garbage in, garbage out, which is to say, you put a bunch of garbage studies in a meta-analysis and what you get is a garbage result out of meta-analysis, which again is true, but again, that's a strength, right? Because since we get to actually quantitatively say, here's the effect of this kind of research design on the results that we found, well, then you can say, well, studies that aren't quite as garbage show a very different result than studies that use a weaker or less internally valid research design. There's a publication bias criticism, which is that the only statistically significant results get published, sort of the replication crisis and in psychology and other places. And again, I find that to be another strength of meta-analysis, is that it can reveal whether or how much this is actually true, right? So we can look at both, you know, unpublished or gray literature studies and say, are they finding a systematically different result than what's getting published in the peer-reviewed journals? And if you're finding a very different result, you can say, well, maybe there's an issue here with publication bias or a positive statistical significance publication bias. Final criticisms is that sometimes you're making apples to oranges comparisons. So one study is not actually that much like another study. So you're comparing two things that are apples and oranges. We have to remember apples and oranges are both fruit. And so sometimes some comparisons are valid and some aren't, right? And so that can be a problem as long as, but you have to be very clear about what you're doing and what you're collecting. And again, like any peer-reviewed article is good if you acknowledge its own limitations. So one of the strengths that I have is when I publish them is acknowledging honestly my own limitations. And sometimes apples and oranges comparisons is a real limitation of quantitative meta-analysis. The advantage, though, I think, is that it helps us to rely more on the weight of the evidence rather than which papers were the first to publish in a particular area, which papers have many citations, right? Articles get cited not necessarily because of the quality of the article itself, as you all know, but on the reputation of the authors, of the journal in which it's published in, right? And so this sort of ignores that altogether. There's no weight in here at all for citations. It just says we're going to include them all together and see what shakes out. And then also one advantage of meta-analysis, which I'll get into here in a little bit, is that it helps to eliminate these statistically significant but practically meaningless studies, which is to say, I found this result that has a t statistic of 4, but the actual effect on policy is essentially nothing, right? Like some job training program help people earn, $50 more a year, which is basically meaningless, right? But has this very statistically significant. Helps to sort of eliminate some of those issues. It helps leverage our issues of generalizability, design, and theory. It helps us compare like studies and understand whether certain studies are outliers or not, which I'll show here next. And then it gives greater benefits for replications or conceptual replications. So one of the problems generally of social science, one of the emerging problems, is that we don't replicate studies often enough. Particularly lab experiments in the social sciences, because there's no real benefit for doing so. So if you just say, I'm replicating so-and-so study, and you try to send it to the same journal that published that study, they're like, well, this doesn't contribute anything new knowledge, right? We've already done this study before. And so one of the things is it doesn't provide that incentives. But in a meta-analysis, I'm going to include that in the meta-analysis and give you as much weight as the original study as well. So again, one of the issues, it says one of the advantages is I can actually take all the studies. So this, the fact you can't read this, don't worry about that too much. But one of the things that you can do here is this is basically all the studies on a particular topic. It takes the average effect size within that study. So I might combine multiple models together, which is convenient for this, but not always great for later on. And later on, I'll separate them out. But it starts to show you that some of these studies that are farther to the right would have small little gray boxes and large black boxes, black lines. Those black lines are standard errors. So the smaller your study is, the larger the standard error. So you see some outliers up here in the upper section of this table that are positive and statistically significant, but they are outliers in the sense that they have these wide confidence intervals associated with them. And you have some larger studies which show very small result or almost no result, but have very, very small standard errors because they have a large sample size. They're more likely to be a precise estimate. So you can actually plot all these studies on here and take a look at where all the studies exist in the history of literature compared to one another, which is a really cool place. So, if I'm publishing in this area, I can find my own study and say, oh, what did I find? Did I find something that's similar to what everybody else found or something particularly different? So I've been told at conferences that people when they do the meta-analysis, they look for where their study fell in this list, this tree that we have here. One of the other advantages I think of meta-analysis is that it helps to enhance people's statistical understanding of what's going on. So in social sciences, a t-statistic of 3, which is approximately it's a p-value about 0.01, which is we think of in a lot of tables, it gets 3 asterisks next to it, which is signified as being very statistically significant. People then interpret that thing as being oh, this is the capital T truth. That's not really what's going on. But you know what I mean? It's sort of the layman's version of what's going on. One of the things that people don't realize is that if you were to find a t-statistic of 3 for a study that had only about 30 observations to it, or degrees of freedom of 30, that actually is a fairly large effect size, meaning it's a strong relationship between the y and x variable. I'll get into how to measure that here in a little bit. But if you have 100,000 observations in your study, which is pretty common for administrative data, it's a pretty small effect size because everything in very large data sets tend to be statistically significant because you have very, very precise estimates. And so for those, if you don't really pay attention to the sample size of an article or a study, it's hard for you to sort of compare two studies to one another. And what meta-analysis allows us to do then is to actually adjust for the sample size and the precision in making estimates about how large of an effect we actually observed. And as you might imagine, right, small studies find both small negative and small positive effects, whereas larger studies tend to be more precise, tend to be more centered around what the true average, the true population parameter should be. But it's just one of those things that people oftentimes don't realize that for the T statistics. Okay, so how do you conduct a meta-analysis? So the first thing you do is you decide what is it you're studying. Which seems like pretty easy to do, is actually quite a bit harder than you might think, because there's lots of studies that are sort of on the fringe of what you're trying to study. So you're creating a document what's called an inclusion criteria document, which is saying, what is my construct? What are the things I'm measuring that becomes my X variable? What's the construct of this vague idea that we're measuring for my Y variable? And then what's the relationship between the two? So a personal example I had is I was studying performance management systems and organizational performance. And I got into this whole literature of these studies about teacher performance, of it, like the performance of schools. It wasn't really what I was intending to study, but according to the own rules I set up, they actually fit the meta-analysis I was doing. So I had to code all of these studies about teacher performance, even though that wasn't what I was really trying to study. So when I did my meta-analysis, I sort of did one sample that included the teacher, this TAP program, and one that didn't include this teacher performance stuff, because I sort of was trapped by my own rules. But setting up good rules early on is helpful. Then you conduct the literature search, which is basically a combination of the search terms you set up and the search engines. One of the nice things about this is that Google Scholar has sort of taken over the world. When I first started this about 12 years ago, Google Scholar was good and getting better, but like EBSCOhost and ProQuest and all those, you basically had to search all of them to find everything. Now I've seen meta-analyses that only search through Google Scholar and maybe one or two other search engines, because Google Scholar really brings up just about everything. And then you need to find a way to search through gray literature, and what gray literature you search through depends a lot on your field. So if you're doing economics, NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, is something you have to search, which may not show up on Google Scholar reliably. Dissertations and theses show up in ProQuest, so you have to search the ProQuest dissertation and theses. So you're going to find the gray literature as well. That helps understand publication bias in a minute. And then I always do what's called ancestry and legacy searches, and then acceptable author email, which is basically look at who they cited and articles that cited that paper that I find. And then I also email every author of the studies I'm coding to make sure they don't have something that they've never submitted anywhere sitting in their file drawer on their computer that they might send me, because I know they're at least studying in this particular area. The lit search process, again, is also structured and methodological. So you do the keyword searches based on the title. If the title seems like it could be relevant to what you're doing, you read the abstract. The abstract says, hey, we're doing a case study analysis. Well, you can throw it out. Oh, we're doing a literature review. I get to throw that out. But if it says we did some sort of quantitative analysis, now I've got to read the entire paper. And based on the entire paper, if it looks like they've got at least one statistical relationship between my X and Y I care about, it becomes what's called an acceptable paper. Process, an example of one I have here on the slide of one literature review I'll talk about. But we started with somewhere like 100, sometimes you get like 100,000 things that you look at, or 10,000 titles you look at, all the way down to 25 papers that actually meet all the criteria that we set up. Once you find acceptable papers, you code the studies. Like everything else, you try to put together a coding instrument. Just something you would do with an interviewee. Like if I was interviewing someone, I have my coding document, and I do the same thing for the article, right? So you ask questions based on the theoretical, research design, generalizability issues I mentioned before. Whatever interesting questions around that particular subject, you code the paper. And sometimes there are things that the article itself tells you specifically, and sometimes it's things you know about the article. So for example, what's the discipline of the author publishing the article? Or what country does it take place in? That's not something that the article really cares that much about. It'll tell you something in the data sample, but I'm going to code it because I think it has something to do with the theoretical constructs, the interesting parts of these particular papers. And in social sciences, we almost all use a Pearson's R/Fisher's Z based effect size. Those of you who know, most people have taken at least one statistics class have heard of correlation, right? And what Pearson's R is essentially a partial correlation coefficient. It's taking a relationship from a regression model, and it's going to code that one relationship between the X and Y variable in a regression model using its t-statistic and the degrees of freedom available. And the t-statistic comes from the correlation coefficient divided by its standard error. It's really easy to code, actually. I mean, I have a document I've set up once, again, 12 years ago, and I go through every time, and it runs the code very easily. It's not a super, those who are fairly familiar with statistics have heard of these relations before. It's not intended to be very complicated. It's just the process of doing that. And then we'll put together a weight as well, which is the sample size minus 3. So each study is weighted by how large of a sample size it uses, because as you imagine, smaller samples are more likely to be outliers, larger samples less likely to be outliers. So again, you start coding things like research design, year of the study, sample composition, any other interesting things that are interesting or live questions in the field of inquiry. So it does require typically someone who's a subject area expert to do a meta-analysis, or one of the co-authors, because it helps you figure out, all right, what are people who are going to read this paper interested in doing? And then most of those things are binary variables or categorical variables recorded to binary variables. So like year is one of the outliers, but like, did they use, what kind of technique did they use? OLS versus Logit versus ProVit versus difference in means. That's a categorical variable that you recode to a binary variable. And then if you do multiple coders, you got to do all the things about multiple coders. What percent of agreement do you have on training data or Cohen's kappa? Make sure that that each of the authors are would code the papers the same way, having seen the same papers. And that becomes a bit of that's always really fun, because then like the first time you do it, you train papers. In fact, I'm doing that tomorrow with one of my co-authors. And I know already we're going to code one of these papers very differently, because we just are. So we got to figure out how we actually agree on what the construct is. So when we go back and code all the rest of the papers, we're coding them the same way based on how we agree. And then that helps you to refine your coding instruments as well. The best part about meta-analysis is meta-regression, which, I know it's like the nerdiest terms ever, right? Meta-regression. So meta-regression, so it's not that interesting in social sciences to say, what's the unconditional mean effect size? Basically saying, using a scale, it's basically -1 to 1. What's the relationship between this X variable and this Y variable? And it's like, all right, that's just one number. It's basically as if you're running a regression with no other control variables, no X variables at all. It's like, what's the average of the Y variables? In lab settings, maybe that's interesting, but in social sciences, that's like really, really boring. You should report it, but after that, it's like really what makes it interesting is, why are these studies different, right? Why are we finding different results for different studies based on, and helping to quantify, all these studies who do it this way find this, and all the studies who do it that way find this. That's really the more interesting part. So meta-regression is basically just a version of what's called weighted least squares. So ordinary least squares is just regression. Weighted least squares, you weight each observation based on some criteria. The weights in meta-analysis come out of statistical theory, which basically says studies that have a larger sample size should be weighted more than studies that have a smaller sample size. And then another part in, which I won't get too much into here, is an assumption about what's called heterogeneity. Do we think all these studies come from one true effect, or do we think all the studies come out of a range of possible true effects? In the social sciences, again, it's really simple because we don't do a lot of lab experiments. So we almost always assume the widest possible heterogeneity. We think there's a lot of place and context-based differences between the studies. And so we almost always use sort of what's called the random effects meta-regression. And then I also like to what's called reverse code my meta-regression, so that my intercept, so in a normal regression, the intercept is basically a useless piece of information. It's like where the line crosses the y-axis and nobody ever interprets it. And it's like, it's boring. But in meta-analysis, that's actually like the thing that's what we're interpreting, because the intercept, if you code things in reverse, so like bad theoretical constructs or bad research designs are coded as a 1, then the intercept becomes the best possible paper. Like the gold standard of papers shows this kind of effect. And that's captured in what we normally call the constant or the intercept. And so it ends up becoming really, really interesting and useful on its own, when in most regressions it's totally extraneous piece of information. Problems you run across with meta-regressions, small cell sizes with dichotomous variables, non-independence of observations. These are all things that can be sort of fixed with a different analysis, different strengths. So I'm going to skip over this one for the sake of time, but let me talk a little bit about publication bias and then get into some of my studies. So again, one of the most interesting things about publication or meta-analysis is it can reveal publication bias. Does it exist? To what extent does it exist? And there's two sources of publication bias. One is the file drawer problem, which is basically, I have a paper, it shows results different than the field expected, and therefore I'm not going to even try to publish it because it won't get published. Or it's a statistically significant result, so I'm not going to try to publish it. And the second is because papers that show a different result than the field expects get rejected, and so they end up becoming unpublished. So we have this publication bias that has two forms. So it's my first picture here. This is a way to look for publication bias. It's called a confounded plot. And basically the way that each of these little plus signs is one effect from a study. So I've got all these different effects from a study. It's the relationship between these two variables I care about. And farther to the right is a positive result, farther to the left is a negative result. And you can see these on the center of the same line. These are all effects from essentially the same study. And the farther up you go, at the top of the pyramid, that's larger studies because they have a smaller standard error. So that's why the pyramid's at the top there versus a smaller study. So you've got this, you can break this into 4 quadrants, right? You've got large studies that have a negative result, large studies that have a positive result, small studies with a negative result, and small studies with a positive result. And what you're looking for is like, if there's missing studies in maybe one of these 2 quadrants, that would be an indication that there's possibly publication bias from the file drawer problem. People don't even send it out. And then you can also do the same thing with the unpublished work. So my gray X's now are superimposed on top of the black pluses, and the gray X's are unpublished studies. These are working papers, student dissertations, think tank publications, whatever it is. And now you're looking to see whether or not there seems to be a systematically different pattern between the published papers and the unpublished papers. So in this particular case, I would say, just a visual, it doesn't see a big problem with publication bias. I don't see a distinctly different pattern between the two, although there's more, there are less visual tests you could do as well to look at this, but I want to look at a visual version of this. Okay, so let me spend 5 minutes just talking about my papers, and then we'll get to some questions because I'm already going to be past my time. So one paper I published, meta-analysis I published about 5 years ago, was the relationship between performance management and organizational performance. And the biggest idea here is that, going back about 30 years, in 1990 or so, there was this big movement in public administration called New Public Management. There was the idea of like, public agencies should steer, not row. We should rely on contracting. We should enhance performance, really measure and track performance to increase the performance of public organizations, which are seen as being largely dysfunctional, inefficient, yada, yada. And so we had basically 15 years or 25 years of examples of people implementing these performance systems, and no one had sort of sat down and sort of quantified it. And so we have all these different reasons why these performance systems might or might not work, like something about the organizational environment, something about the way the performance system was implemented itself, and something about the external or elected environment as well. All of those things mattered, right, in terms of whether or not these performance systems might be successful. So as I'm publishing this paper, you still have people now today you can find who are consultants who are like, yeah, performance management is great. It's going to improve your organization. Your organization is going to improve, day overnight. And then all these academics come and say, well, maybe, right? We've got all these problems. It's implemented from above, and people manipulate data, and displaces goals of organization. So like you got practitioners who are like, this is great, and academics are like, this is maybe not so great. And we don't really have a great, didn't have a lot of shared sense of whether or not this was true or not. And so I did a meta-analysis, right? And so I found 49 different papers that study performance management. There's 2,200 different separate effects. So I hand-coded 2,200 effects in all these different varieties areas. So education, job training, crime, police, right? All of those. Again, apples and oranges, criticism is totally right here because I'm comparing policing to public health, but I'm trying to do the best I can while doing that. And then I publish this meta-regression. And so this is basically like what a regression table would normally look at. So like I said, one of the main things you can find is the unconditional mean effect size, what's the overall average. And so in a Pearson's correlation coefficient, which ranges from -1 to 1, I found an effect of positive 0.03, which is basically 0. It's statistically different from 0, but it's basically 0. When you implement some of the best practices that I could measure from the papers, benchmarking, whether you did a bottom-up approach versus top-down, and whether you measure outcomes rather than outputs, I found a much stronger approach. So I showed that the theoretical concerns about performance management actually bear out. It's a stronger effect when you do that. Studies that had a strong research design showed an effect that was actually 0. So weaker studies show a stronger effect, which is bad. You have more bias in those. But when you combine them together, strong theory and strong research design, I once again found a very strong positive result. So this was great. I mean, it's very rare that you get someone from like Governing Magazine or whatever to say this made them rethink the entire field of performance management, which is what I got out of this literature, because it was like, this is all the papers that we have on this topic, and this is what we know, right, about those issues. It became really, really, it was a great way. So it sparked a lot of conversation, I guess I'd say, about this particular field. I guess. So, and then this is the individual level effects. Like if benchmarking is absent, one of the strongest findings I saw was that you had very little effect of performance management because you didn't know who you're comparing yourself against. So one of the strongest things that came out of this was to use benchmarking in performance management. Another quick example, the relationship between race and income and urban tree cover of my friend Shannon Watkins. So great things about this is she's an urban forester. I am not. But now I get emails all the time about my expertise in urban forestry. I'm like, sorry, man, like I have no idea what's going on there. We published this paper, and so there's all these tree planting organizations around the country. They try to plant trees in different areas, but there's all these concerns that the trees get planted in rich white neighborhoods rather than lower income or minority neighborhoods. And so because there's a sort of purposeful tree planting issues of public tree planting, the question is, can we use public policy to reduce that disparity? And bigger question is, how big is that disparity to begin with, right? How big is it to begin with? So we did this work. The issues at hand was that, well, all the literature is based on usually one city. So here's an example from a study that uses San Francisco tree population. They're spatially correlated. So that means that if you have one plot, it's very correlated to the plot next to it. And so that's a methodological issue. The relevant characteristics were sometimes just used as justice control. So I'm just controlling for income. And all sorts of different remote sensing methods were used. The most common one is called NBVI, which basically takes satellite imagery and categorizes infrared and infrared versus visible light streams. And they're trying to code that based on it. So they do different ways of doing NBVI. So there are methodological concerns too that the geographers really cared about because they want to know whether different types of remote sensing found different results. So there were some aspects of that were very specific to this field. So we did all the studies. You can see here that forest plot that I have here, which is funny, we did a tree study, and one of the main things out of meta-analysis is called a forest plot, but that's what it is. You can see there's some big outliers in some of the other studies that we found. Found 25 studies, some that double dip. So we have 19 that accounted for income and 10 for race, and we coded 283 effects, which is fewer than my last study, but still a lot. I'm not going to show the statistical results, but the basic idea here is that we found very little relationship for the correlation between race and urban tree distribution, but found a very strong relationship between income and urban tree distribution, even controlling for some of the other effects that we care about. So there was like the results of this literature was that there is a very strong correlation with income and the distribution of urban trees, which can then lead to implications about if we're going to have tree planting programs, we should target them to lower neighborhood census tracts or lower income census tracts. Because they're missing urban trees, and there's a lot of benefits of urban trees. And I'm 3 others I'm working on right now: method of sale and interest costs, which I should be sending out this month. I just got to finish writing it. Contracting and organizational performance, which again I'm working with soon, and then intergovernmental aid. So finishing up, why meta-analysis for social sciences? Because it helps us to take stock of where we are. Meta-analysis came over from medicine. Medicine uses it quite a bit. Social sciences does not use it nearly enough. we have lots of areas where we've had these debates in literature about something for now 2 or 3 decades, and nobody sat down and said, what do we actually know about this literature at the moment? We will do these lit reviews, and the lit reviews will only cite the first or most important papers and sort of miss out on all the literature that's come after. And that's a real gap. There's so much, science coming out right now. I mean, good social science, that it's hard to really keep track of it all. The other thing is about it, why should you personally do meta-analysis? Because it's a citation machine. So the 3 that I mentioned there have citations of 300, 88, and 68 citations, because it's driving the conversation in that field. So it's the work of like 2 separate papers in 1 or 2 or 3, but it ends up driving the conversation in that field, which helps me to then say you're contributing to the science in that area, which is really, really great. And I think there's a movement towards these Bayesian meta-analysis, updating our priors as to what we thought the relationship was. And so there's really exciting movement in the methodology of meta-analysis as well, which makes me think that's going to be around for quite some time, and making improvements on previous meta-analyses as well. So thank you very much. I know I'm way over time here, or at least what I wanted to, but I really appreciate everyone coming here. I've got some resources for you. Hopefully we'll share the slides about, there's the Cochrane collaboration is a handbook about how to do meta-analyses that is pretty approachable. We've got a couple of books, and then how to do meta-analysis in Theta or in R, depending on which language that we tend to use. And then my references of some of the things that I've written in other places you can go to look for what is meta-analysis from an approachable point of view. So, all right, thank you. Questions from in the room, or don't see any on the chat yet? I'll pull it up.
Oh,
yeah.
Since no one else has a question, as I'm watching this, I'm trying to be like, well, how do you make sense of the meta-analysis results? And one question that was occurring to me, and then you answered, was, well, some studies include statistical controls, and they seem to be theoretically well designed on the basis of what controls they include. Some parts are like, well, I code for that when I'm going through the studies. With that study where you looked at the effect of income versus race on tree cover. So when you're looking at the effect of race on tree cover, and you're finding that's different from the effect of income on tree cover, of course, income and race are going to be correlated. So in the meta-analysis, is the effect of race on tree cover controlling for income? Like, do you throw out ones that don't control for income, or do you just like really downrank them?
No, so we actually, what we did in that case, and I don't think we showed it in this model or this result, was that we looked at when our primary focal, the relationship was race and tree cover, we looked at papers that controlled for income in some way or didn't. And so it's a control in the meta-analysis for whether the original paper controlled for it. And for income, that made a big difference. Like if you controlled for race, the effect of income was quite a bit smaller. So there is because obviously income and race are so highly correlated with one another, there is a possibility that it's going to bias it. There is an argument. So again, the interesting part of this field of environmental justice is they care. So some of them argue that you shouldn't control for, you should look at the effect of race on tree cover by itself, without income as a control, because is over controlling if you control for income, because race is determined earlier than your income. And since race helps determine income by controlling it for income, you're basically over determining the model. So it is a debate in that literature about whether or not you should control for it, and whether controlling for it actually reduces the results. So, but we could show, one of the cool things about this is we could show both versions. We look at all the studies that controlled for race, controlled for income, while looking at the relationship between race and urban trees, and all of them who didn't. And some studies did both, even within their own papers. And so that was actually a really important theoretical debate that was going on in that literature, even at this time, of whether you should control for income when you're studying for the relationship between race and tree cover.
I feel like one thing I'm getting from this is the quality of the meta-analysis depends in large part on how well the meta-analysis was conducted.
Yes. Well, it's like every research, right? I mean, unfortunately, there's no meta-analysis that writes itself, and so you have to unfortunately do the work yourself. And so, yeah, I've seen some, I mean, meta-analysis can be done with some really basic mistakes being done, and I've seen them, they get published. I get to ask for, nice thing now that I publish them, I get asked to review them all the time, so I'm able to weed out. Some of them are just making some basic mistakes, but I don't obviously get asked to review everything. And so, yeah, it really, the quality of the meta-analysis itself depends really on the process that you took. But again, it's fun to be able to say, look at, you know, there's navel gazing, which is to say, I think this matters, or I don't think this matters in a conference setting, you know, the person sitting in the back of the room making their statements. And I actually go look at all the research that's out there and say, is that person right or not? Like, given all the research that we know about the subject, does it actually matter whether you control for income when you're looking at the relationship between race or ethnicity and urban tree cover? So, you know, it's really cool. Yeah, I should mention we did race and ethnicity. So we did in the studies that we had, it was primarily, well, every study did it differently because they did percent, some of them did percent non-white population, some did percent Asian, Hispanic, African American. I mean, so every study itself was so different. The meta-regression on race and ethnicity was real difficult to do in a single way because all the different studies chopped up the census because they use census data primarily. So how they decided to use the census data was fascinating. I'm happy to be done. I'm always good when classes are ended and the students have no questions, which means they've learned everything I taught them precisely. So that's always really great.
Okay, random question.
No, you're good. No, I did the same for Tony last week. So I'm, you know, I need one person to ask lots of questions.
This isn't even a good question. This is like a student question, kind of like on. So internal validity, you're calling it internal validity, and you and others, I've heard this term before, is like how well the study is designed. So what is external validity?
Generalizability. So external
Okay.
validity is how well you can apply that study to a different set of circumstances or time.
That's external.
External validity.
Okay.
Yeah, it's program evaluation terms, right? But it has ended up, you know, crossing. So economists use the term endogeneity for everything, but it also applies to a lot of what's called internal validity concerns, which is whether or not your study, the relationship that you're studying, you know, is truly representing that relationship, whether there's something else like a bounding variable or something else in there. So depending on, and I got trained across lots of different fields, good and bad. So I can sometimes crosswalk between those languages, but yeah, internal validity is how well the study does itself from program eval, which is separate from economics.
Thanks. How much time does it take you to conduct a meta-analysis? Because it seems like it could take forever.
Yeah, I would say typically it takes me at least 18 months
Okay.
from the conception of the idea to finishing writing. Now, you know, as all things, I could have done it faster, right? I could every summer, like I could have been more productive this summer, one of those things. But it really does take a lot of time to sit down and to code the studies. It takes a long time to search for the studies. And so it has taken me about 18 months per study, which is why I've only published 3 so far as an associate professor. And I started one of them in my doctoral program. And I have 3 more I'm working on. So you just can only do so many at a time. You know?
Okay.
One I'm co-authoring with 5 different authors. That was actually quite helpful because they were able to split up the work quite a bit. But it takes it's a lot of effort compared to some of the analyses I have done. Some statistical analyses.
Did you encounter pushback from either philosophically about what you're doing or from individual studies that say, no, you missed the point of what we were doing?
I've not done the individual version. I've not seen anyone individually say it's not, but I think there is a general critique of it as well, which is that, you know, the critiques that I mentioned there. The most common of which I think for social sciences tends to be the apples and oranges comparison, which is like you're combining these studies for all the different things and you can't really combine them. They don't mean a lot when you combine them, which I think is true to some extent, right? What happens is, my argument is that if we have more studies, we can combine everything together because I'm not going to explicitly say what's the difference between all the different important decisions you have made. But because I'm always limited to the actual literature that we have, usually I can only examine a few of the decisions and not all of the decisions. So there is more of a philosophical critique to doing it as well. But I think all of them, even those people who haven't had the philosophical critique, it's actually really nice that you found all these studies and put them together in one paper, because now I can go find this other stuff that I know are studying something similar to what I'm studying. So it's actually been a good way to combine lots of different fields together, because performance management in general tend to be very siloed. So if I'm studying policing, I'm studying policing. If I'm studying public health, I'm studying public health. I don't talk to each other. And one of the good things that came out of that was that there was more cross-pollination of what are all these performance systems that exist and who's studying.
One question that occurs to me is, there are some people who write literature review articles or whatever, and they try and be detailed and include, all the published stuff anyway. And are you aware of whether there's like, I'm going to assume that you're inclined, you're like, are there big different, like, are you aware of a situation where there's literature review and a meta-analysis and they came up with different conclusions on the same topic? Or like, is it just that literature review is going to have a lot of limitations?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, there were plenty of literature reviews on performance management that existed before I did it that were like, here's all the great things about performance management that were purported literature reviews. And there's just a lot of them out there. And my results were much more qualified than that. So I think it's because of the inherent limitations of a literature review. I mean, every paper you publish, you do a literature review of some extent about what's important, and it's important that you do that. I find systematic reviews to be better than literature reviews. So systematic review is I'm going to search for every paper in the subject, and it basically stops at the point where you code the studies, or maybe there's a table. It's like, here's a dependent variable, here's the independent variable, here's the sample. And so it qualitatively says, yeah, right. And I like those better. I mean, and I did one of those myself and published one of those recently because the studies really were just too different to do a meta-analysis. They're on different topics. And it was the impact of tax exemption on municipal bonds. And there just were too many different angles that people were taking, and no single angle will study enough, I thought, that I could do. Like, I didn't want to do 5 meta-analyses. So I just did a systematic review. And so, there are advantages, there are pros and cons to each approach. Generally speaking, though, I'm sort of out on literature reviews, like, seeing literature reviews. And, it is easy enough nowadays to do something in a systematic process, a replicable process, that there's not really much of an excuse not to do that anymore. Let's put it that way. But, journals will still publish them, so I'm not. Yeah. If that's what you're writing, that's what you should write.
But if it takes 18 months to do one, where you gotta get stuff out in 5 years. You gotta get stuff out in 5 years.
I'm not publishing any literature reviews.
Right. Yeah. No. It's fine if you are. I think there are good uses for them. The literature reviews are really good when there are not enough studies to do a meta-analysis. So if this is an emerging field and there's only 8 to 12 studies or something, and not all of them are comparable enough, that's a great time to do a literature review. It's a relatively new topic. What I found after I published my meta-analysis, so my performance management meta-analysis has been in the field the longest. And what I found after I published is that the market for literature reviews in performance management dropped significantly, right? I mean, it just wasn't, they were like, well, what are you offering that's different from what this meta-analysis is? And the answer was nothing, right? I mean, I'm not adding anything. I couldn't add anything. So the market for that dries up quite a bit when you start seeing meta-analysis in those fields. So there's one out recently on strategic management. There's a guy from Belgium who both we're the 2 publishing meta-analyses in my public administration right now. And he did one on strategic management recently, and that same thing happened, right? It was like, now we have a meta-analysis on strategic management. What do you add in by another literature review on strategic management? Not a lot, right? Because we did someone who took the time to find every study on the topic and then code them, or every quantitative study, I should say, and then code them. So it changes the way the field looks at something.
Like where the field is at this moment in time.
Oh yeah. So one of the things I really wanted to do in the performance management meta-analysis was understand the effect of gaming. So gaming has teaching to the test or down coding policing. There's all the different forms in which we have this performance system, and it changes the behavior of the bureaucrats in a way to try to adapt to that performance system. Broadly speaking, we call that gaming. And I really wanted to know what effect is there if a scholar looks for and finds gaming, like what effect does that have, right, on the actual, how much of gaming is there out there? And of the 49 papers I studied, I think maybe 6 to 8 of them even considered the possibility of unintended consequences. consequences, which is not great, right? And so one of the things that came out of my meta-analysis was we need more, every study that publishes on performance management or some sort of performance system needs to consider the effects of unintended consequences, because almost every study who searched for it found it, except for maybe one that I looked for, found some unintended effects, including one of the papers that I had published that was included in my own meta-analysis. So, so it does end up changing the field, and then you start seeing more when people are writing on that subject, more considering that issue as being sort of alive. It becomes more there's more of a spotlight shining on the deficiencies of the literature from what you're unable to code from the analysis. So I had a whole list of things like I tried to code for these, and I couldn't because the papers don't describe what they're doing, don't tell it. One of the recommendations coming out of the urban trees one is that the geographers don't even report sample size sometimes. They report the correlation coefficient and how many stars it has, and they don't report the sample size. Because I don't know, because I showed you the map and that should be good enough, right? And she just was like to count all dots. Like one of them had like 100,000 dots in it. And I'm like, well, I can't. So one of the recommendations for that was report your sample size, because the statistics don't make any sense unless you actually report your sample size. So the recommendations for each field varies quite a bit based on what we see as deficiencies from that literature.
All right, thank you all for joining us. It was our last brown bag series, but we will be continuing for the spring, so stay tuned and have a great day.
Thank you.